In 1919, one of the most powerful men in America began building a private palace on a remote hill in California. Over the next 28 years, that palace would consume millions of dollars, import entire European ceilings and monasteries, and remain permanently unfinished. Its owner was not royalty, that he was William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon who shaped public opinion, fueled wars through headlines, and openly believed he could control reality itself. At this estate, Hollywood's biggest stars were invited and quietly discouraged from leaving. Schedules were enforced, movement was managed, even laughter followed a system. When the Great Depression struck, Hearst's empire collapsed. Rooms were sealed, staff were fired, and the palace became too large for its owner to control. By the time Hearst lost the castle, it had stopped being a home and had become something else entirely. This is not a story of luxury. This is the story of how obsession, power, and control built one of the most disturbing monuments in American history. So why did a man who controlled newspapers, politicians, and public opinion end his life trapped inside a palace he could no longer afford or escape? If you value deeply researched stories about forgotten Gilded Age wealth, power, and the architecture that shaped history, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments which estate or dynasty you want explored next. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was not ruled solely by presidents, generals, or industrialists. It was ruled by information. And no one understood that more clearly than William Randolph Hearst. By the age of 37, Hearst controlled a newspaper empire unlike anything the country had ever seen. His publications dominated New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, and dozens of other cities, reaching millions of readers every single morning. For a growing nation hungry for stories, Hearst did not merely report events. He shaped the version of reality that people believed in. Hearst's newspapers thrived on what later became known as yellow journalism. Sensational headlines, exaggerated crimes, emotional language, and selective truth. Facts were secondary to impact. Fear sold better than calm. Outrage sold better than nuance. His papers turned ordinary incidents into national crises and elevated rumor to the level of certainty. By the late 1890s, Hearst had discovered something profoundly dangerous. If you controlled the story, you controlled the response. In 1898, during the rising tensions between the United States and Spain, Hearst's newspapers played a decisive role in fueling public anger. Graphic illustrations, unverified claims, and emotionally charged headlines pushed readers toward war. When reliable information was scarce, his papers filled the gaps with speculation and drama. Whether Hearst directly caused the Spanish-American War remains debated, but the outcome was undeniable. Public opinion moved in the direction his newspapers pointed it. Power like that does not fade quietly. Hearst did not see himself as a journalist. He saw himself as an architect of public consciousness. Presidents feared his headlines. Politicians courted his approval. A single negative campaign in one of his papers could end a career. This influence gave Hearst something far more intoxicating than wealth: the belief that reality itself was negotiable. If an event did not align with his worldview, it could be reshaped. If a truth threatened his interests, it could be buried beneath spectacle. By the 1910s, Hearst's power extended beyond publishing. He was a political force, a cultural tastemaker, and a symbol of unchecked influence. But power, when left unchallenged, begins to turn inward. The same obsession with control that defined Hearst's newspapers began to dominate his private life. He demanded loyalty from employees, obedience from associates, and admiration from guests. He surrounded himself with people who rarely contradicted him, and over time, disagreement became absence. This desire for control did not remain abstract. It demanded a physical environment, one that reflected his authority and insulated him from resistance. In 1919, at the height of his influence, Hearst made a decision that defied practicality and common sense. He would build a private palace, not in an urban center where power traditionally resided, but on a remote hilltop overlooking the Pacific Ocean in California. The location was isolated, difficult to access, and hostile to large-scale construction. And that was precisely the point. Hearst was not building a home. He was building a controlled universe. This estate would not simply house him. It would regulate everyone who entered it. Movement could be observed. Schedules could be enforced. Isolation could be framed as privilege. Guests would feel honored to be invited, yet subtly constrained once inside. Unlike the outside world, where even Hearst faced competition and resistance, this environment would answer to him alone. As construction began, Hearst's obsession deepened. Plans changed constantly. No design was ever final. What mattered was not completion, but control. The estate expanded not according to necessity, but according to impulse. Every new structure reinforced the same message: permanence, dominance, and scale beyond reason. It was an extension of Hearst's psychology, built in stone. But while Hearst's private world grew larger, the foundations of his empire were quietly weakening. His spending habits were excessive, his business interests overextended, and his confidence dangerously absolute. When the global economy collapsed in 1929 with the onset of the Great Depression, Hearst discovered a limit he could not edit or suppress. Advertising revenue vanished. Debt mounted. The newspapers that once printed money began to bleed it. For the first time in decades, Hearst could not bend events to his will. The man who had shaped public emotion with headlines could not shape financial reality. The palace on the hill, designed as a symbol of dominance, became a liability. Rooms went unused. Staff were dismissed. Entire sections of the estate were sealed off, not for secrecy, but because maintaining them was no longer possible. What had begun as a monument to power slowly transformed into something darker, a reflection of obsession unchecked by restraint. The larger the estate grew, the more it demanded money, attention, control. And as Hearst's influence in the outside world diminished, the palace remained, silent and immovable, growing heavier with meaning. By the early 1930s, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. Hearst still possessed fame, connections, and fragments of his empire, but the illusion of omnipotence was gone. The estate he had designed to dominate others now dominated him. Leaving it became difficult. Maintaining it became impossible. And the isolation he once controlled began to control him in return. This was the paradox at the heart of Hearst's legacy. He built a palace to escape limits, yet it exposed every one of them. He shaped reality for millions, yet failed to shape his own ending. And the structure rising above the Pacific coast, unfinished, oversized, and increasingly silent, stood as evidence that power, when pursued without restraint, does not create freedom. It creates confinement. To understand the full weight of that confinement, one must now confront the place itself, the land, the isolation, and the deliberate distance from the world below. Because the hill Hearst chose was not accidental. It was a statement. By the time William Randolph Hearst turned his attention away from newspapers and toward stone, he already knew exactly what he was building. He was not searching for comfort. He was searching for extension. The palace would not correct his obsession with control. It would amplify it. And for that, he needed land that behaved the same way his mind did, elevated, isolated, and resistant to interference. That is why he chose the hill. High above the Pacific coast near San Simeon, Hearst selected a location that made no practical sense. It was remote, exposed to violent coastal winds, frequently swallowed by fog, and completely detached from any urban center. There were no roads capable of supporting large-scale construction, no nearby workforce, no infrastructure waiting to be used. Every rational argument spoke against it. Hearst ignored them all, because rationality was never the point. This hill offered what Hearst had always demanded: distance. Distance from criticism. Distance from interruption. Distance from the ordinary world that refused to remain obedient. From its summit, the ocean felt endless and the land below felt small. It was not chosen for beauty alone. It was chosen for dominance. From the beginning, the land resisted him. Every stone hauled uphill required effort bordering on punishment. Materials had to be dragged through terrain never meant to support them. Workers labored against wind, elevation, and isolation. Construction slowed, stalled, and broke down repeatedly. The hill did not cooperate. It demanded submission. Hearst responded by pushing harder. Instead of adapting the design to the land, he imposed scale upon it. Taller towers, wider terraces, larger foundations. What could not be accommodated naturally was forced into place. The estate did not grow from the hill, it pressed down on it. Architecture became an act of will. This relationship mattered, because it shaped how the estate would function psychologically. Unlike homes built within communities, this palace existed apart from life. There were no neighbors, no accidental visitors, no casual exits. Everyone who arrived here did so deliberately, and once inside, the hill ensured they remained contained. The geography itself became part of Hearst's system. Distance discouraged spontaneity. Elevation discouraged escape. Leaving required planning, effort, and coordination. Arrival felt ceremonial. Departure felt disruptive. Guests came up the hill feeling chosen. They stayed because the alternative was inconvenient. Control did not need to be enforced openly. It was embedded into the landscape. From above, the estate felt sovereign. From below, it felt unreachable. The hill also changed scale. Against the vastness of ocean and sky, excess no longer appeared excessive. Grandeur felt justified. Expansion felt necessary. Structures that would have seemed absurd elsewhere appeared proportional here. The land absorbed extravagance and returned it as a monument. For Hearst, this was ideal. The higher the estate rose, the quieter the outside world became. News still reached him, but it arrived filtered. Events still occurred, but they felt distant. Inside the estate, time slowed into routine. Meals followed schedules. Activities followed expectations. The environment rewarded predictability and punished deviation. This was not accidental. This was design. But isolation is a double-edged instrument. The same distance that protected Hearst from interference also insulated him from correction. Without friction, excess normalized itself. Without challenge, obsession reinforced itself. The hill created an echo chamber where every decision justified the next. As years passed, the cost of that decision grew heavier. When Hearst's finances began to collapse during the Great Depression, the hill did not soften. Supplying the estate became more difficult. Maintaining unused wings became irrational. Entire sections were closed, not for secrecy, but because they could no longer be sustained. The land that had demanded constant effort now exposed the consequences of limitless ambition. Age and illness deepened the effect. The climb that once symbolized authority now required energy Hearst no longer had. The elevation that once placed him above the world now separated him from it. Travel grew difficult. Presence diminished. The hill did not care. Fog became a constant companion. Sound was swallowed. Horizons disappeared. The estate felt suspended, cut off not only from people, but from time itself. What had been chosen as a vantage point slowly transformed into a boundary. By the time Hearst's role at the estate began to fade, the hill remained unchanged. It had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had isolated power. It had magnified control. And when control weakened, it ensured that the reckoning would be private. The land had not failed him. It had obeyed him perfectly. Because once you build a world designed to contain others, it eventually closes around its creator. And inside that closed world, something else was happening, something even more revealing. As the hill isolated the estate from the outside, the castle itself began to grow without limit, without completion, and without restraint. That obsession would soon become impossible to ignore. Once the hill had done its work, once distance, elevation, and isolation were secured, the real obsession began. The castle was no longer a plan. It became a process, and that process had no end. Construction at Hearst Castle did not follow the logic of ordinary building projects. There was no final blueprint, no fixed completion date, no moment when the work was meant to stop. Instead, the estate evolved through constant revision, expansion, and correction. Rooms were redesigned after completion. Structures were altered mid-construction. What had been approved 1 month was dismantled the next. The castle did not grow toward a goal. It grew in response to impulse. At the center of this process was Hearst himself. He reviewed plans obsessively, demanded changes relentlessly, and rejected finality outright. Satisfaction, for him, was temporary. Completion felt like surrender. Each finished section only exposed the possibility of something larger, something grander, something more permanent. The estate was not being built to be lived in. It was being built to be extended. This obsession found its most visible form in scale. Towers rose higher than necessary. Terraces widened beyond function. Staircases multiplied. The castle's footprint expanded without restraint, as if size itself were a defense against uncertainty. The architecture spoke a single language, more. But excess alone does not explain what happened here. What made the process unsettling was its refusal to resolve. Even as buildings stood complete, they remained provisional. Nothing was immune to revision. Nothing was allowed to settle into permanence. The castle existed in a state of perpetual becoming, never allowed to arrive. This endless construction had consequences. Labor was constant. Noise never fully disappeared. Scaffolding became a permanent feature of the landscape. Guests walked past active work zones, stepping around materials and unfinished walls. What should have been a retreat felt instead like a controlled construction site, alive, restless, and unresolved. The castle mirrored its creator's state of mind. Hearst's insistence on revision was not driven by function. Many changes offered no practical improvement. They served no structural need. What they offered was control. Each alteration reaffirmed authority. Each redesign delayed final judgment. As long as the castle remained unfinished, it remained obedient. This dynamic extended beyond architecture into time itself. The estate consumed years, then decades. Construction began in 1919 and continued for nearly 30 years. Entire phases overlapped without closure. The past was never sealed. The future was never defined. Everything existed in a continuous present of work, adjustment, and anticipation. Obsession thrives in such conditions. The castle absorbed enormous resources. Materials were imported from across the world: stone, ceilings, doors, fragments of older civilizations repurposed into decoration. What had once belonged to monasteries, churches, and estates elsewhere was dismantled and reassembled here, stripped of context and pressed into service. History became inventory. Culture became ornament. And still, it was never enough. Hearst's demands intensified as the estate grew. What had begun as a grand residence expanded into a self-contained complex of guest houses, pools, theaters, and service structures. The line between necessity and indulgence disappeared. Each addition justified the next. The castle became a machine that required constant feeding. Yet the more it expanded, the less it functioned as a home. Rooms were lavish but rarely used. Spaces designed for gathering felt ceremonial rather than comfortable. Circulation became complicated. Intimacy dissolved under scale. The estate did not invite rest. It demanded attention. It demanded management. It demanded presence, not warmth. Guests sensed this imbalance immediately. They arrived expecting leisure and encountered routine. Schedules governed daily life. Activities were structured. Meals followed strict timing. The castle did not adapt to its inhabitants. Inhabitants adapted to the castle. This was not hospitality, that it was orchestration. As years passed, the contradiction deepened. The estate continued to grow even as Hearst's ability to sustain it weakened. Financial strain mounted. Maintenance costs ballooned. Yet construction did not stop. Ending the process would have meant confronting limits: financial, physical, psychological. Obsession resists such confrontation. The Great Depression intensified the pressure. Revenue collapsed. Debt accumulated. Decisions that once felt grand now felt reckless. Wings were closed as soon as they were completed. Entire sections fell into disuse almost immediately. The castle grew larger as its usable space shrank. This was the quiet turning point. What had once symbolized control now exposed vulnerability. The unfinished nature of the estate no longer suggested ambition. It suggested instability. The scaffolding that had once promised growth now implied incompletion. The constant activity no longer felt productive. It felt compulsive. Hearst's presence at the estate diminished. Age and illness reduced his energy. Travel became burdensome. The castle, once shaped entirely around his will, now required more from him than he could give. And because it had been designed without restraint, it offered none in return. The obsession had succeeded too well. The estate no longer served Hearst. Hearst served it. Every addition had increased dependency. Every redesign had postponed resolution. The castle had become an endless demand on money, on labor, on attention. It could not be paused. It could not be simplified. It could only continue or collapse. And slowly, collapse began to feel inevitable. Construction did not stop because the castle was finished. It stopped because the system sustaining it failed. The obsession outlived its resources. What remained was a vast, intricate structure frozen mid-thought, caught between intention and abandonment. In the end, the castle stood as a record not of achievement, but of compulsion. Its unfinished state was not a flaw. It was the final truth. A monument built not to conclude, but to continue, until continuation itself became impossible. The hill had isolated Hearst from the world. The castle had isolated him from completion. And inside that unfinished monument, another system was operating quietly, one that governed not stone, but people. As the architecture expanded without limit, so too did the rules that shaped life within its walls. That system would reveal the darkest aspect of the estate yet. By the time the castle's scale became impossible to ignore, another system had already settled into place, quieter, subtler, and far more disturbing. It did not rely on walls or towers. It relied on routine. Inside Hearst Castle, control no longer needed to announce itself. It was built into the rhythm of daily life. Guests arrived believing they had been chosen. Invitations were rare, prestigious, and carefully managed. To be summoned to the estate meant proximity to power, culture, and exclusivity. Hollywood actors, directors, politicians, and cultural elites climbed the hill expecting indulgence and freedom. What they encountered instead was structure. From the moment they arrived, time ceased to belong to them. Days began on schedule. Meals were fixed. Activities were prearranged. Even leisure was curated. Breakfast was served at a specific hour. Afternoons followed approved diversions, swimming, horseback riding, guided walks. Evenings ended with formal dinners, seating assigned, conversations subtly guided. Nothing was explicitly enforced. Nothing needed to be. The environment itself discouraged deviation. Leaving was possible, but never simple. The estate's isolation made spontaneous departure impractical. Transportation required planning. Cars were limited. The hill demanded commitment. To leave early was to disrupt the system, to signal disinterest, to risk exclusion from future invitations. Most guests stayed, not because they were forced to, but because leaving felt socially costly. This was Hearst's most refined form of control. Guests often stayed for days, sometimes weeks. What began as privilege gradually transformed into routine. The longer one remained, the more autonomy dissolved into expectation. Schedules replaced choice. Participation replaced preference. The castle did not adapt to its guests. Guests adapted to the castle. Hearst presided quietly over this system. He did not need to issue commands. His presence alone shaped behavior. Conversations adjusted around him. Topics softened or sharpened depending on his mood. Guests learned quickly what pleased him and what did not. Approval was subtle. Disapproval was quieter and far more effective. This was not imprisonment. It was something more refined. Luxury masked constraint. Comfort disguised compliance. The environment rewarded those who followed its rhythms and marginalized those who did not. There were no locked doors, but there were invisible boundaries. There were no guards, but there were expectations. Even pleasure was regulated. Parties at the castle became legendary, lavish, elegant, and meticulously organized. Music echoed through halls built for spectacle. Wine flowed. Laughter filled the terraces. But these gatherings were not spontaneous celebrations. They were performances. Guests knew when to appear, where to sit, and when to retire. Excess was permitted, but only within the approved framework. Freedom existed, but only inside carefully defined limits. Over time, the distinction between host and authority blurred. Hearst was generous, attentive, and charismatic. Yet generosity does not cancel dominance. It reinforces it. The more he gave, the more he was owed gratitude, loyalty, presence. The castle functioned as an ecosystem where everything flowed toward a single center. This system affected everyone differently. Some guests thrived within it, enjoying the predictability and prestige. Others felt unsettled, unable to name the discomfort they experienced. Time moved strangely here. Days blurred together. The outside world felt distant, almost irrelevant. News arrived filtered. Reality softened. The hill ensured separation. The castle ensured immersion. As Hearst aged, this controlled environment became more rigid, not less. Routines tightened. Familiar faces were preferred. New voices were rare. The estate slowly transformed from a social hub into a closed circle. What had once felt glamorous began to feel repetitive. What had once felt exclusive began to feel enclosed. And yet, guests continued to come. Because leaving the orbit of power is often harder than entering it. The true darkness of the system lay not in cruelty, but in its effectiveness. No one was chained. No one was openly restrained. But autonomy eroded quietly. Decisions deferred. Preferences adjusted. Over time, guests stopped asking when they would leave and began asking what came next on the schedule. The castle had achieved what Hearst's newspapers once had: influence without force. But systems built on control do not adapt well to change. As financial pressures mounted and Hearst's presence diminished, the routines continued even as their purpose faded. The structure remained, but the energy behind it weakened. Guests stayed for shorter periods. Entire wings went unused. The orchestra silenced. The schedules loosened, not because freedom returned, but because there were fewer people left to control. What remained was the residue of a system that had outlived its moment. The house had not locked its guests inside. It had simply made leaving unnecessary, until it wasn't. And when the parties faded and the invitations stopped, the estate revealed its final truth. Without people to absorb its routines, the castle felt vast, empty, and unresolved. The same mechanisms that once orchestrated life now amplified silence. The house had never needed doors to keep people inside. It had used privilege instead. And in doing so, it revealed the most unsettling aspect of Hearst's creation. Control, when disguised as luxury, is almost invisible. But there was one person inside this system who experienced its consequences more deeply than anyone else. Someone who lived at the heart of the castle, smiled for its guests, and paid a price that history nearly forgot. That story comes next. For most guests, Hearst Castle was a temporary world. For one woman, it was life itself. To understand the true darkness of Hearst Castle, one must stop looking at stone and start watching a single face. A face that appeared in photographs, magazines, and newsreels, always smiling, always composed. That face belonged to Marion Davies. And behind that smile was the most carefully controlled life on the hill. Davies did not arrive at Hearst Castle as a guest. Guests could leave. She arrived as something else entirely, an essential component of the system. For more than 30 years, her life unfolded inside an environment designed to revolve around one man's needs, moods, and routines. She lived at the center of unimaginable wealth, yet remained permanently on the outside of power. Publicly, Davies was presented as Hollywood royalty. Privately, her position was far more fragile. William Randolph Hearst was married, politically exposed, and obsessed with control. That reality defined everything about Davies's existence. She could be adored, but never acknowledged fully. Celebrated, but never legitimized. She occupied the emotional core of Hearst's world while remaining legally and socially undefined. Hearst Castle made this imbalance permanent. Inside the estate, Davies's role was clear even if it was never spoken aloud. She was expected to soften the environment, to host, to charm, to absorb tension. Where Hearst imposed structure, she provided warmth. Where the castle felt cold and imposing, her presence made it livable. This was not leisure. It was labor, emotional, constant, and unpaid. Her days followed Hearst's rhythms, not her own. Meals, gatherings, and social appearances were aligned to his preferences. Spontaneity was discouraged. Absence was noticed. Independence was quietly penalized. The castle rewarded compliance with comfort and punished deviation with isolation. Davies learned quickly that resistance had consequences. Hearst's control extended into her professional life with devastating precision. Determined to shape her into a serious dramatic actress, he used his power to secure prestigious roles that ignored her natural talent for comedy. Davies was genuinely gifted at light-hearted performance, but Hearst considered comedy inferior. Prestige mattered more than authenticity. Critics were merciless. Audiences were unconvinced. And Davies paid the price. Each failed dramatic role reinforced the public narrative that she was talentless, successful only because of Hearst's influence. The truth was more painful. Her failures were engineered by someone who believed he knew better than she did. Her successes in comedy, where she excelled, were dismissed or minimized because they did not align with his vision. Hearst's power protected her career while quietly suffocating it. At the castle, this contradiction was impossible to escape. Davies entertained guests who admired her charm without understanding her limitations. She smiled through dinners, performances, and endless social rituals. Laughter became expectation. Cheerfulness became obligation. Her private frustrations had no safe outlet. Luxury surrounded her, but choice did not. The castle's scale amplified her confinement. Its isolation removed alternatives. Its routines erased negotiation. Davies could not redefine her role without threatening the stability of the system she helped sustain. And so she adapted, not by resisting, but by enduring. This endurance was mistaken for happiness. Visitors often described Davies as joyful, generous, endlessly lively. Few recognized the discipline behind that image. Maintaining warmth in an environment structured around control required constant effort. Davies became the emotional shock absorber of Hearst Castle, absorbing tension, smoothing conflict, and ensuring that guests left with pleasant memories. The cost of that role was invisible and therefore easily ignored. As Hearst aged, the burden intensified. His world narrowed. His tolerance for disruption diminished. Familiar routines hardened into rules. Davies remained constant, anchoring a system that no longer expanded but refused to release its grip. When financial pressures mounted during the Great Depression, the illusion of abundance faded, but her obligations did not. Rooms closed. Staff disappeared. Parties thinned. The castle grew quieter. Davies stayed. She witnessed the estate's transformation from vibrant spectacle to echoing monument. She adapted to its shrinking world without complaint. Even as Hearst's power eroded, her dependence deepened. The castle still revolved around him, and she still revolved around the castle. History later distorted her story. Popular culture reduced Davies to a stereotype, frivolous, shallow, undeserving. Fiction replaced fact. Her intelligence, resilience, and genuine talent were erased in favor of a convenient narrative. What these portrayals missed was the reality of her position. A woman living inside an empire that denied her agency while demanding her presence. Davies was not weak. She was constrained. Hearst Castle did not imprison her with walls. It bound her with privilege, expectation, and emotional obligation. She was given everything that could be seen, and denied everything that could not. In the end, Davies outlived Hearst. She survived the collapse of the empire, the fading of the castle's influence, and the rewriting of her own story. But survival is not the same as freedom. The years spent inside that system left marks no architecture could display. Her story exposes the most unsettling truth about Hearst Castle. Its darkest impact was not measured in money, scale, or excess, but in lives shaped quietly by proximity to power. Davies paid that price daily, smiling through it, performing stability for others while surrendering her own. The castle needed her more than it ever acknowledged. And as long as she smiled, the system worked. The castle demanded control, IT demanded loyalty. And it demanded resources at a rate even Hearst could not sustain. Every empire eventually reveals what it costs to maintain. At Hearst Castle, that reckoning arrived quietly, not with collapse or scandal, but with numbers that no longer added up. The palace on the hill had been designed to expand endlessly, but it had never been designed to survive restraint. And restraint was now unavoidable. By the late 1920s, the estate had become a machine that consumed resources at an extraordinary rate. Thousands of acres required constant upkeep. Buildings demanded round-the-clock maintenance. Staff had to be housed, fed, and paid. Imported materials needed protection from coastal weather. Nothing here was self-sustaining. Every day the castle existed, it required more. For years, this hunger had been masked by abundance. But when the global economy collapsed in 1929, abundance vanished almost overnight. Advertising revenue, once the lifeblood of Hearst's media empire, dried up. Debt, long ignored, became impossible to disguise. The financial structure supporting the estate began to crack, and the castle responded the only way it knew how, by demanding more. The contradiction was brutal. At the exact moment Hearst needed to reduce spending, the estate required greater investment just to prevent decay. Maintenance could not be paused without consequence. Repairs delayed became repairs multiplied. Every closed room still aged. Every unused wing still deteriorated. The castle punished neglect as aggressively as it had rewarded excess. Cuts began slowly, then accelerated. Staff numbers were reduced. Entire teams vanished. Roles once considered essential were eliminated. Rooms were sealed not for privacy, but because there was no longer money to heat, clean, or maintain them. Lights went dark in corridors that had once glowed with spectacle. Silence replaced orchestras. The estate began shrinking from the inside. Yet the castle remained massive. Hearst faced a problem no amount of influence could solve. His newspapers could shape opinion, but they could not print money indefinitely. Loans mounted. Assets were leveraged. Control slipped. The man who had built an empire on confidence now faced limits that refused negotiation. The estate did not care. At Hearst Castle, luxury had always been framed as permanence. Now it revealed itself as fragility. Ornate rooms went unused for years. Pools sat empty, their stillness reflecting a different kind of absence. The very scale that once symbolized dominance now amplified loss. Hearst responded the only way he knew how, by trying to hold everything together. Construction slowed, then stalled. New additions ceased not because the castle was finished, but because continuing had become impossible. For the first time in decades, Hearst was forced to accept something he had always rejected: limitation. The unfinished sections of the estate became monuments not to ambition, but to interruption. The emotional cost of this shift was severe. Hearst's presence at the castle diminished. Age, illness, and financial stress eroded his stamina. Travel became difficult. Decision-making slowed. The system that had revolved around his will now struggled to function without constant input. The castle, designed to respond to one authority, faltered when that authority weakened. Guests noticed the change. Invitations became fewer. Stays grew shorter. Familiar routines lost their urgency. The energy that once defined the estate dissipated, replaced by caution. Laughter sounded out of place. Grandeur felt excessive. What had once been spectacle now felt exposed. For those who remained, the transformation was unmistakable. The castle no longer expanded. It contracted. Spaces closed off like memories no longer revisited. The environment shifted from celebration to preservation, from living to holding on. And still, the estate demanded care. Maintenance crews worked around closed wings, preserving emptiness. Servants cleaned rooms that would not be used. The castle insisted on attention, even as it offered less in return. It had been built to command resources, not adapt to scarcity. In this, it reflected its creator perfectly. Hearst's empire outside the hill continued to unravel. Control over newspapers weakened. Influence diminished. The public image he had once managed so precisely began to fracture. Power, once expansive, now felt defensive. Inside the castle, the effect was claustrophobic. Isolation intensified as activity declined. Without guests, the estate felt vast and hollow. The routines that had once structured life now highlighted absence. Days grew longer. Nights grew quieter. The castle no longer distracted from reality, it confronted it. This was the moment the monster revealed itself. The estate had been designed to grow, not to stop. When growth ended, meaning collapsed with it. The palace had no smaller version of itself. No modest state. It existed at full scale or not at all. And now, sustaining that scale was draining the last reserves of Hearst's power. The reckoning was not dramatic. It was slow, relentless, and private. Assets were transferred. Control was surrendered in increments. Decisions once made unilaterally now required approval. The empire that had once bent others to its will now bent inward. Hearst Castle stood above it all, unchanged in appearance, but fundamentally altered in purpose. It was no longer a symbol of expansion. It was a reminder of cost. Every closed door spoke of a choice delayed too long. Every unused room echoed with excess. Every silent terrace reflected ambition without restraint. The monster had been fed for decades. Now it consumed its creator. And as Hearst's grip weakened, a final transformation approached, one that would strip the estate of its private power and expose it to the public eye. The palace that had once controlled access was about to lose control entirely. Because when an empire can no longer sustain itself, it must surrender something it never intended to share. Its legacy. The castle could no longer be fed. And soon, it would no longer belong to the man who built it. When power fades, it rarely disappears all at once. It withdraws slowly, leaving behind structures that no longer know what they are meant to do. That was the state of Hearst Castle in the final years of William Randolph Hearst's life. A palace still standing in full grandeur, but quietly abandoned by the authority that once animated it. Hearst did not leave the castle dramatically. There was no final declaration, no symbolic farewell. His absence accumulated gradually. Visits became shorter. Decisions were deferred. Presence turned intermittent. The estate that had once revolved entirely around his will began to operate on momentum alone, following routines long after their purpose had faded. Age and illness narrowed Hearst's world. Travel up the hill grew difficult. The physical exertion required to navigate the estate became exhausting. The vastness that once symbolized control now demanded energy he no longer possessed. And so, without announcement, the castle began to outlive its creator. This absence changed everything. Without Hearst at its center, the estate lost its organizing force. Schedules loosened. Gatherings diminished. The subtle hierarchies that had governed behavior softened, then disappeared. Guests no longer arrived in steady numbers. Invitations became rare. What had once been a tightly controlled system began to drift. The castle did not adapt well to this shift. It had been designed for authority, not autonomy. Its scale assumed command. Its routines assumed obedience. Without a central figure to impose order, the estate felt oversized and unsettled. Rooms stood ready for guests who never came. Dining halls remained set for conversations that no longer occurred. The architecture continued to perform its role, even as the audience vanished. Silence filled the gaps. Staff remained, but their work changed in tone. Maintenance replaced hospitality. Preservation replaced preparation. Instead of orchestrating events, they managed to decline. The castle's daily life became about holding ground, keeping deterioration at bay rather than creating experience. The energy that once flowed outward now turned inward, focused on survival. For Hearst, this transformation was deeply personal. The palace had been conceived as an extension of his authority, a physical manifestation of influence. To see it functioning without him was to confront a reality he had long resisted. Power is temporary, and structures endure only as long as they are needed. The castle no longer needed him. That realization marked the quiet end of Hearst's reign. His influence outside the estate had already diminished. His media empire was fragmented. His ability to command attention had eroded. Now, even the environment he had built to reflect dominance no longer responded to his presence. The palace had become a relic of a system that no longer existed. As Hearst's health declined, his world contracted further. Decisions were handled by others. Control was delegated. Authority dissolved into administration. The man who once shaped public opinion through headlines now occupied a far smaller sphere, one defined by limitation rather than expansion. The castle stood above it all, unchanged in silhouette but altered in meaning. Its towers no longer signaled power. They marked distance. Its terraces no longer framed spectacle. They framed absence. What had once been a command center now felt like an artifact waiting to be interpreted. This transition revealed an uncomfortable truth. Hearst Castle had never been a home. It had been a mechanism. When the operator stepped away, the mechanism continued briefly, then stalled. Without intention, scale became burden. Without authority, control became emptiness. The palace did not grieve its creator. It simply continued to exist. Hearst died knowing that the estate would outlast him. But survival was not the same as success. The castle had achieved permanence at the cost of relevance. It remained intact, but its purpose had evaporated. Power had left no successor. In its final private years, the estate became something new, a space suspended between ownership and inheritance. It no longer belonged fully to Hearst, yet it was not free of him. Every room carried his decisions. Every corridor echoed his preferences. Even in absence, control lingered as memory. But memory cannot manage maintenance. Memory cannot pay staff. Memory cannot justify scale. The castle was too large to remain private and too expensive to remain symbolic. Its future demanded transformation. And that transformation would strip it of the last thing Hearst had guarded so fiercely: exclusivity. The palace without a king was about to gain a public. And with that shift, the meaning of Hearst Castle would change forever. From private empire to public spectacle, from controlled environment to curated history. The final irony was unavoidable. The man who built the estate to control access would be remembered through open gates. Hearst Castle survived its creator, but survival required surrender. When an empire can no longer sustain itself, it must choose between disappearance and exposure. For the palace on the hill, that choice arrived not as a dramatic collapse, but as a quiet transaction. Control was replaced by preservation. Privacy was exchanged for survival. And the estate that had once operated as a closed world began a new life, open, curated, and observed. The transformation of Hearst Castle into a public site was not driven by sentiment. It was driven by necessity. By the late 1940s, the reality was unavoidable. The scale of the estate made private ownership impractical. Maintenance costs continued to rise. Revenue from Hearst's remaining enterprises could no longer justify the burden. What had once symbolized dominance now represented risk. The castle could not remain what it had been, not because its meaning had faded, but because its size demanded constant resources. In 1957, the inevitable occurred. The Hearst Corporation donated the estate to the state of California, retaining limited family use but relinquishing control. With that decision, the final layer of Hearst's authority dissolved. The gates that had once regulated access opened permanently. The palace that had been designed to exclude now invited the public inside. This shift altered everything. The castle was no longer a living environment shaped by routine and presence. It became an artifact, a site of interpretation, a place where movement was guided not by power, but by pathways and signage. The same rooms that had once enforced schedules now hosted tourists following time slots. The same halls that had absorbed whispered compliance now echoed with explanation. The transformation was precise and deliberate. To survive as a public institution, the estate had to be reframed. Its darker realities were softened. Its mechanisms of control were translated into anecdotes. Excess became fascination. Obsession became ambition. What had once functioned as a system of influence was repackaged as architectural wonder. This reframing was not dishonest, but it was selective. Guides spoke of art collections, imported ceilings, and European craftsmanship. They highlighted scale, beauty, and expense. What received less attention was the psychological weight of the place, the routines, the isolation, the subtle erosion of autonomy. Museums preserve objects more easily than experiences. And so the castle's most unsettling qualities faded into background. Visitors arrived in steady numbers. They climbed the hill in buses designed to make the ascent effortless. Where guests once arrived cautiously, tourists now arrived comfortably. The hill lost its resistance. The castle lost its exclusivity. Rooms that had once been closed to all, but the chosen few now welcomed crowds. Terraces once reserved for controlled gatherings became photo opportunities. Pools once drained by silence reflected cameras and voices. The estate functioned, but differently. Power had been replaced by curiosity. Yet the architecture did not change. The scale remained overwhelming. The distances remained deliberate. The separation from the world below remained intact. Even as a museum, the castle retained its ability to disorient. Visitors moved through spaces designed for control, often without realizing it. Paths guided movement. Barriers limited access. Narratives shaped interpretation. In subtle ways, the system endured. What changed was ownership of the story. No longer controlled by a single will, the castle became a shared symbol, claimed by history, tourism, and cultural memory. It could no longer enforce routines, but it could still influence perception. Visitors left impressed, unsettled, or both. The estate no longer dictated behavior, but it continued to shape response. This was Hearst's final irony. The man who had built the castle to control reality lost control of how that castle would be understood. The estate survived him by becoming something he had never intended: public property. His private world became communal experience. His controlled environment became an educational exhibit. And yet, the essence of the place remained conflicted. As a museum, Hearst Castle exists in tension between admiration and unease. It celebrates craftsmanship while hinting at excess. It invites wonder while resisting intimacy. It opens its gates while maintaining distance. Visitors are allowed inside, but only so far. Some rooms remain closed. Some stories remain softened. Some silences remain unexplained. The castle does not confess easily. What the public sees is beauty framed by history. What lingers beneath that framing is something heavier, a reminder of how ambition can outgrow intention, how control can disguise itself as culture, and how monuments built to dominate time often become frozen within it. The estate did not escape its past by becoming a museum. It preserved it. Every tour retraces decisions made decades earlier. Every explanation echoes a choice once enforced. The castle continues to function as a system, no longer of power, but of memory. And memory, like architecture, can be curated. But even curated history has limits. Because beneath the polished narratives and restored surfaces lies a simpler truth. Hearst Castle endures not because it was wise or humane or restrained, but because it was extreme. It survived because it embodied excess so completely that it could not be ignored. The empire faded. The man disappeared. But the structure remained. And in remaining, it became something Hearst never anticipated, a mirror held up to ambition itself. The story was no longer his to control. The castle was preserved. But preservation is not understanding. For decades, William Randolph Hearst had controlled how stories were told. He decided which truths were amplified, which were softened, and which disappeared entirely. Newspapers obeyed him. Editors deferred to him. Public memory bent around his influence. But in 1941, something unprecedented happened. A story appeared that Hearst could not edit, suppress quietly, or rewrite to his advantage. It arrived in the form of a film. When Citizen Kane premiered, it did not name Hearst directly. It did not need to. The resemblance was unmistakable. A newspaper tycoon, an immense private estate, a life defined by power, isolation, and loss. Audiences immediately recognized what Hearst himself recognized most clearly of all. This was not fiction. It was exposure. The film's central figure, Charles Foster Kane, built a vast estate called Xanadu, a palace so large it ceased to function as a home. Its halls echoed. Its owner wandered alone. The structure grew as meaning collapsed. The parallels were too precise to ignore. Xanadu was not inspired by Hearst Castle. It was modeled after it. For Hearst, the shock was existential. He had spent his life shaping public perception. Now perception was being shaped without him. The film did not accuse him directly, but it framed his legacy through a lens he could not control. Power was shown not as triumph, but as isolation. Wealth was depicted not as fulfillment, but as compensation. Control was revealed as insecurity made permanent. Hearst understood immediately what was at stake. If the film succeeded, it would redefine him, not as a titan of industry, but as a cautionary figure. A man who built monuments to mask absence. A ruler of information who failed to understand himself. For someone whose identity depended on narrative dominance, this was intolerable. Hearst responded with everything he had. He attempted to suppress the film before its release. His newspapers refused to advertise it. Editors were instructed to attack its creators. Studio executives were pressured. Threats were made, subtle at first, then explicit. Hearst used the same tools he had refined for decades: influence, intimidation, and silence. But this time they failed. The film reached audiences anyway. Critics praised it. Its themes resonated. And while it did not immediately destroy Hearst's reputation, it planted something far more dangerous, a permanent alternative narrative. From that moment on, Hearst was no longer the sole author of his own story. The irony was profound. Hearst Castle, once a private environment engineered to regulate perception, now existed alongside a fictional counterpart that exposed its psychology to the world. Xanadu distilled the estate's meaning into a single image, a palace too large to contain its owner. Where Hearst Castle had once symbolized command, the film reframed it as confinement. Hearst never forgave this portrayal. He spent the rest of his life resenting the film, refusing to watch it, and attempting to erase its influence. But resentment could not undo what had already occurred. The story had escaped him. Control, once absolute, had limits. As years passed, Citizen Kane grew in stature. It became not merely a film, but a cultural reference point, a shorthand for unchecked ambition and the emotional cost of power. Hearst Castle, whether mentioned explicitly or not, became inseparable from that interpretation. The palace on the hill was no longer just architecture. It was symbolism. This shift marked the final collapse of Hearst's narrative authority. He could donate the estate. He could preserve the buildings. He could protect the art. But he could not protect meaning. The public no longer saw Hearst Castle only as a marvel of wealth. They saw it as a question. Why build so large? Why isolate so completely? Why control so relentlessly? The film had reframed the conversation, and history followed. What made this loss of control especially painful was its permanence. Newspapers could be revised. Headlines could be forgotten. But cinema endured. Each new generation encountered the story without Hearst's permission. The reflection he hated could not be shattered. In this sense, Citizen Kane accomplished what no rival, critic, or economic force ever had. It placed Hearst inside his own creation and revealed the emptiness he had tried to outrun. The castle became not a defense against mortality, but evidence of it. Hearst died knowing this mirror would remain. By the time his estate opened fully to the public, visitors arrived carrying the film's shadow with them. They walked through rooms already interpreted by cinema. They saw towers already framed by fiction. The castle could no longer exist as neutral space. It had been contextualized. And that context was not kind. The greatest irony is this. Hearst built his empire on storytelling. He understood better than anyone that narratives define reality. Yet in the end, the story that defined him was written by someone else, and told more honestly than he ever could have allowed himself. The palace on the hill still stands. The film still plays. And between them lies a truth Hearst spent his life avoiding. You can control information. You can dominate systems. You can even shape history for a time. But eventually, the story escapes. And when it does, it becomes the only thing that lasts. Hearst lost control of his story. But the castle still remained, waiting for history to decide what it truly represented. When the noise finally faded, when the headlines stopped, the guests disappeared, and the arguments about power lost urgency, what remained was the structure itself. Hearst Castle still stood above the Pacific, unchanged in outline but transformed in meaning. Stripped of authority, stripped of exclusivity, it waited to be understood. For decades, the castle had been described as many things: a masterpiece, a fantasy, an indulgence, a marvel of wealth. All of those descriptions were accurate, and yet all of them missed the point. Hearst Castle was never meant to be judged only by what it was. It must be judged by what it did. It organized people. It shaped behavior. It rewarded obedience and discouraged departure. Long before it became a museum, the castle functioned as a system, one designed to reflect a single worldview. Its scale enforced hierarchy. Its isolation reduced alternatives. Its routines replaced spontaneity. Architecture was not a decoration here. It was instruction. This is what Hearst Castle really was, a physical ideology. William Randolph Hearst did not build the estate simply to enjoy wealth. He built it to stabilize meaning in a world he believed could be controlled. The castle was an attempt to freeze power in place, to turn influence into stone and authority into permanence. Every tower was a declaration. Every terrace was a boundary. Every closed gate reinforced a single idea. This world answers upward. But ideology is fragile when it demands constant reinforcement. The castle required endless attention, endless money, endless control. It could not be left alone. It could not simplify itself. It could not adapt. And when the man who sustained it weakened, the system revealed its flaw. It was too large to be flexible and too rigid to survive change. In that sense, Hearst Castle did not fail. It fulfilled its purpose completely. It showed exactly what happens when ambition is unchecked by restraint, when control replaces trust, and when scale becomes a substitute for meaning. The estate grew larger as intimacy vanished. It expanded as satisfaction receded. Completion was always delayed, because completion would have forced an ending. And endings were what Hearst feared most. The castle's unfinished nature is not an accident of history. It is its truest feature. It reflects a mindset that could never settle, never conclude, never accept enough. Every unfinished wing, every revised plan, every sealed room tells the same story. Power pursued without limit does not arrive at peace. When the estate became public, that story did not disappear. It simply changed its audience. Visitors now walk paths designed to guide movement. They stand in rooms designed to overwhelm. They follow narratives curated to explain excess. And even without knowing the full history, many leave with an unsettled feeling they cannot quite name. The architecture still works. It still influences response. The castle no longer commands obedience, but it still demands attention. What Hearst Castle ultimately represents is not wealth, but warning. It shows how easily influence can harden into isolation, how comfort can mask constraint, how grandeur can conceal absence. It stands as evidence that power, when built into environments rather than relationships, eventually collapses under its own weight. Hearst wanted permanence. He achieved endurance instead. The difference matters. Permanence implies purpose sustained across time. Endurance implies survival without direction. The castle endures because it cannot be ignored, not because it solved the problems it was meant to address. It remains impressive, but incomplete, iconic, but unresolved. In the end, Hearst Castle tells a quieter story than its scale suggests. It is the story of a man who mastered systems, but never mastered limits. Of an empire that controlled narratives, but could not control consequence. Of a palace built to outlast time, only to become a lesson within it. The towers still rise. The ocean still roars below. The rooms still wait. But the question the castle asks is no longer about Hearst. It is about us. What do we build when we confuse influence with meaning? What do we preserve when power fades? And how many monuments around us are not symbols of success, but records of obsession? Hearst Castle does not answer these questions. It simply stands there, insisting that they be asked. And perhaps that is its final legacy, not as a triumph of wealth, nor as a failure of restraint, but as a permanent reminder that control can shape the world for a time. But it can never finish the story. High above the Pacific, Hearst Castle still stands, unchanged in stone, altered in meaning. It was built to command time, to quiet doubt, to turn power into permanence. But power never finishes the story. It only delays it. What endures here is not wealth, nor genius, nor ambition fulfilled, but the evidence of what happens when control replaces connection, when scale replaces meaning, when a life is measured by what it can dominate rather than what it can hold. The gates are open now. The silence is honest. And the castle remains, not as a victory, but as a question carved into the hill. How much is enough, before obsession builds a monument it can never leave?